Torrents crashed down over ruins built in an age even the deepest Elderkin memory could not recall. That crippled spire, a hideous scar upon the earth, born of the starless age, had not been looked upon by men for long and blissful centuries. But other things lurked amongst those dead old stones, corrupt things made vile by the fell powers that seeped from the depths. Hundreds of rat-like eyes bore witness to the vicious bolt of lightning that struck amongst the stones. The last thing those eyes saw before they were burned away by the power of such an arrival were two men emerging from that deadly light, a one-eyed man in an old robe, and a young man, straight of back and powerfully built. He wore a silver helm upon his black-haired head, and a broadsword belted across his back. Ulrim doffed the salle and let the rain fall for a moment on his face, washing the sweat and heat from him. His flesh sung with the memory of the night sky, of the vast and mountainous clouds piled in their enormity. He had glimpsed stars for but a heartbeat, glimmering and bountiful as the silver sands upon the western shores. And then down, with unspeakable speed, back to the mud, mortal once again. He could only see Zora's blind eye. Thunder rumbled distantly overhead, and the rains rolled out on gentle vespers. "This way," he said, heading towards the crumbling ruin. "What is this place?" "Irom Nathar," said Zoras. "The gates of the dead." Ulrim grunted. In the gloom it was difficult to make out anything like a gate. He could see a tower, or the remains of one, all made of black stone. Unlike the blocky towers of the cities he knew, Irom Nathar seemed fused like wax, melted into a seamless running whole. Time and damage had broken this illusion, though. Huge chunks of the keep and its walls had been blasted away, and what stood had been eroded by countless cruel and lonely years. There was a distinct lack of vegetation on the ground. Only gray, threadbare weeds poked through the gravel, but no moss or lichen stained the fallen masonry. Zoras worked his hands across the face of one such chunk, and then another. Lightning flashed, but distantly, flickering unsteady light across the ground. Spectres leapt out at Ulrim from the stones. Gouged into their waxy surfaces were hideous, leering faces. He scowled and held up a warding gesture. "That has no power here." Zoras stopped before a wall. It seemed to have been stretched from the bones of the earth itself, rather than constructed. Heaps of rubble were dashed about. Evidence of whatever cataclysm had wrought such devastation had focused its fury here. The wall was disturbed in some way, as if it had been... Ulrim groped for the word as his hand slid unconsciously towards the hilt above his shoulder. His eyes struggled to take in the space. They slid over it like beads of water over wax, as if it had been removed. "A great fiend is buried here at Irom Nathar," said Zoras. He rolled up the sleeves of his robe. Bony, claw-like fingers began to massage the air. "My master spoke of this place many years ago. After he died, I read his notes. I have dreaded it ever since, and prayed I would never stand before the gates of the dead myself." "A fiend?" "A man who sold his soul to the powers of the hells. A warlock known as the Dead Tongue, a great captain of the enemy. During his reign, this place was his keep, in the time before the return. After he was slain, it became his tomb, and the gates were smashed to seal it off." "My people built cairns for the dead, barrows for the chieftains." Zoras searched Ulrim's face and said, "There will be no more cairns for your people, will there, Ulrim?" The younger man looked away bitterly. "Alas, for the passing of great men and worthy kings! The world shall never know their like again. But hark! The Dead Tongue was a master of these lands. He cursed them, broke them to his will, and drank the very life from them to power his mad designs.
They have laid dead and nearly bare ever since."
Ulrich peered up at the slouching black mound. He felt hundreds of melted black faces glowering down at him. "Then why are we here?" Zoras made a strange gesture and uttered something in a tongue Ulrich had never heard nor wished to hear again. The stones around them shivered and then began to shift, dragging across the muddy ground and rising toward that place of emptiness.
"We are here because what remains of my order has become aware that certain elements are seeking to restore that which we buried here."
"How?"
"Better left unsaid. That is a task for others,"
muttered the old man. He wiped away the rain from his eyes. The stones were assembling against the wall now, and Ulrich was beginning to see a pattern to their angularity. They were forming a threshold. At last it was complete. 2 flat, blank slabs formed the doors themselves. Zoras turned to Ulrich and jerked his thumb at the doors. Ulrich planted his shoulder against the door. It held firm as he pushed with all his might, the heavy lines of his legs and back standing out like cables. Then it gave all at once. He tumbled into the darkness beyond, catching himself with legs wide. In a heartbeat he had unsheathed the brave blade, ready to kill. The ghosts howled within him.
"A charnel house! We have no business here! Leave!"
He stood on a small platform above a stairway that plunged into the gloom. All was still. Ulrich took a breath of relief and gagged. The stink of the grave filled his nose and throat. Old death, ancient blood, lingering, moldering over lightless centuries. No battlefield he had known had ever smelled this rancid. Zoras followed him with silent footsteps, unaffected. Ulrich mastered himself, but he kept brave blade held in a tight fist. Together they descended the broad black steps. Down they crept into the dripping black throat of lightless death. Here and there they passed the bones of warriors long dead, wearing chainmail hauberks and pointed cone bassinets in place of death shrouds. Swords rotted through by rust and age lay in scattered shards. The sorcerer said nothing, but gave them a wide berth. 100 steps, 200. Ulrich lost count. Bodies floated past them, grim spectres drifting in the pale, mystical light the sorcerer held aloft in his palm. Further down they found other bodies, tortured-looking things of alien shape, their bones scrimmed with vile-looking runes. At the first of these Zoras stopped and knelt long enough to scowl and spit. After that he ignored the deranged carcasses. It seemed to Ulrich that they walked through the remnants of a running battle. Many were locked in murderous embrace of violent deaths. Spearheads and sword blades stuck through the beasts, marking desperate doomed acts of valor. Enough to earn an eternity of peace, perhaps, but a bad death none the less. The deeper they went, the worse the nightmare. Remains torn limb from limb, or blasted apart, or shattered. Whether the men had been fighting their way into or out of this horrid place, Ulrich did not know, and did not care to ask. Madness. He began to sense a shift in the oppressive air around them. The air grew closer, and the reek of death more foul. Ahead, the depthless void warmed with a distant red glow. "What is that?" he asked, breaking at last the iron silence.
"The sepulchre!"
They descended the last 50 steps with a great deal of care. The masonry here was ruined, reduced to little more than unsteady rubble. Ulrich went first, picking a safe path, and keeping a careful eye on the old man as he followed. Beyond the flight of stairs was a long, narrow corridor cut through undressed bedrock. It seemed to have been gouged out by some terrible force. The way was choked with bodies, and there was no skirting them now. They waded through the old bones and rusty mail, abandoning any attempt to preserve the dignity of the dead. "How many men died here?" Ulrich's voice echoed over the dry bones. Zoras pulled at his mustache.
Hundreds, I suppose. A fighting force from Kerath by the sea. They're old foes of the Dead Tongue and eager to serve. Though the city's a ruin now, its lands burned by the Ekith reavers, and the citizens put to the sword. They say the Ekith built stone pillars before the city's gates, and draped them in the flesh of their victims. A terrible business.
Orym grunted. The old man talked too much, when he had a mind to speak the truth. Still, the horrors of war were difficult to overstate.
My father spoke of the Ekith as a myth, monsters that crept out of the sea. But Kerath, you say? Do you mean Akareath? Perhaps. It has been many years since I turned my eyes thither. The Carathians were great fighters in their time, summoned by my master to take up their spears and crush a great evil. Heroes to a man.
They came presently to an arched portal in the stone. A vast chamber unfolded beneath a high but natural cavern. Fanged stalactites hung from the ceiling, shedding tears into pools amongst the stones below. Broad colonnades bearing wretched faces lined the walls, one horror twisting into another agonized visage. At the center of the chamber were two great platforms, built like ziggurats in miniature. At the top of one sat a huge ruby carved into the shape of human heart. From this strange artifact radiated a bloody crimson light that washed the whole space in hellish tones, and cast deep black shadows. Upon the other platform was a long box of plain stone. Across the floor, a field of death. Skeletons lay where they had fallen in melee millennia ago, so deep in the earth, in a land so dead that even rot and corruption had not finished the job. Among them were more of the monstrous remains. Whatever they were, they seemed to have been giants. Their skulls were bullish and broad, with sharp curling horns. They were wholly unnatural, freak abominations that had killed many men as they were extinguished. Here and there, wide rings of scorched stones were all that remained of great pyres. The victor's last act had been to burn the Dead Tongue's hoard of secret writings and verboten lore. Zora's voice was grave as he lamented the great deal of knowledge that had been sacrificed, for some of those maddening texts had dated before the return. His master had been adamant, however, they would burn all they found, for all had been tarnished by an even deeper evil. Nothing discovered beyond the gates of the dead would ever again be carried to the surface. Now the silence of the tomb weighed on them like the incalculable mass of all the stone above their heads. A great triumph had been brought here at Irom Nathar, but was this glory? Orym had been living by the blade and claw since his exile. Was such a wretched tomb to be his fate too? Orym sensed something shifting, drifting like a wind felt only on the fingertips. His ring seemed to constrict. He fingered it and looked to the old sorcerer. Zora's storm rider's face was a vision of vindication and odium.
"They missed it," he breathed. "By the blackest hell, they all missed it! All these years, dreaming in the dark, biding his time. We've been lucky, Slayer, incalculably lucky. We must see this terrible task through."
He started across the space, holding his head in his hands as he went, navigating around the piles of the dead.
"Missed what? Speak plain, and tell me why we're really here."
Impatiently, Zoras flapped his hands at the platforms.
"There are two of them. The text says there were three, originally. Those who watch have seen signs across the realms of men. First, a tree of crows with 3 eyes. Then, every baby born in the city of Khorvaire 11 years ago was born with a black tongue. 2 years ago, the dead plagued the jungles of Asakari, east of the mid-valley." "What do these things have to do with this place?" "They are signs. The death curse of the Death Tongue, as my master recorded it, was thus: With 3 eyes shall we watch you, and the children of the sea shall bear my name. At the time of my return, the dead shall go before me, as you have undone my great work, so shall I undo yours."
This was something Orm understood, for once. Zorez spoke in circles, and withheld truth every time he opened his mouth. He spoke of stories and places Orm knew not. But prophecy? Orm was familiar with visions of times yet to come. The kings of the West had kept oracles, and every town had a good mother who read the omens of the sky and field. Concerning prophecies, Orm had only heard one worse than this. He ground his teeth.
"Sounds like they didn't finish the job last time." "It was nearly a rout, and my master was gravely wounded. Those of my order overlooked one of the Dead Tongue's artifacts. There should have been 3 ziggurats, but once the gates were sealed, this place faded from memory. It is here, somewhere. If we destroy it, we silence him forever."
The old man turned his head about, searching with his one good eye.
"This is precisely what I feared. But we will do what we must. Do you stand ready, Ulrim the Slayer?"
The younger man nodded with a savage grin. His gray eyes looked murderous in the obscene light of the diadem high on its platform. Anticipation, battle thrill, began to build in him like a warrior's chant. "My father said it is better to do a thing than waste wind. Tell me what to do."